Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is polio. The year is 1921. Roosevelt is coming off of his electoral defeat in the run for the vice presidency in the 1920 election. To make that run after getting the nomination, he had already resigned as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so now he's out of a job. He's got to go find something to do. He reopened his law practice in New York City and also signed on to run the New York office for the Fidelity Deposit Co of Maryland, which was the fourth largest surety bonding company in the United States. His main job was to bring in new clients. He signed on Howe to join him as his assistant, and also from the recent campaign, Marguerite LeHand came on as his secretary. Marguerite LeHand would always be known as Missy because the Roosevelt children seemed to have trouble saying Miss LeHand. Miss LeHand kept coming out as Missy. She would be Missy, and she would work for Roosevelt for the rest of her life. Now, Roosevelt was out of politics, but he still maintained a very robust correspondence with Democratic leaders from around the country, also getting more and more involved in community events, community service, philanthropic endeavors. One of the things that he was focused on was the New York chapter of the Boy Scouts of America. They invited him to come to the annual Jamboree, which was being held at Bear Mountain. He agreed to do that, was there on July the 28th. After that, he joined the rest of the family that was already at their summer home at Campobello for the balance of the summer. Well, Eleanor was there, the kids were there, Howe was there, family and friends, a lot of sailing and swimming and tennis and deep sea fishing going on over the next several days. On August the 10th, Roosevelt was out sailing with the kids when they spotted an island that had a fire going on. And so they went over to the island, tried to help put out that fire, and came back to the house, and Roosevelt was sort of feeling out of sorts. He decided to take a 2-mile jog to head over to the cold waters of the Bay of Fundy to jump in and kind of get refreshed, but he said, I didn't feel the usual reaction, the glow I'd expected. In fact, got home, he was chilled to the bone, shivering all night, despite 2 woolen blankets trying to keep him warm, and by the morning he was even worse. So Eleanor sent for the local doctor, E.H. Bennett, an elderly country physician who came over and diagnosed a bad cold. But the next day, Roosevelt could not stand. By the evening, he couldn't move his legs. His legs were numb, they were highly sensitive, and he said, I tried to persuade myself that the trouble with my leg was muscular, that it would disappear as I used it, but presently it refused to work. His temperature was running 102 degrees, so they knew this was more than a cold. Eleanor sent the kids off on a 3-day camping trip. Well, they sought a second opinion, and Howe tracked down Dr. William Keene, who was actually vacationing in the area. Keene was a noted surgeon who secretly had performed cancer surgery, removing a cancerous growth from President Grover Cleveland at the beginning of his second term, but that was about 30 years before. He's now 84 years old. He comes in, looks at the patient, and diagnoses a blood clot in the lower spinal cord. He prescribes heavy massages to try to get things right, and very painful massages. Well, the fact is, by the next day, the paralysis was spreading for Roosevelt. Now his arms, his hands, he was always the most optimistic person in almost any room, but he was starting to have some doubts. He later told Francis Perkins that he had been in utter despair, fearing that God had abandoned him. Well, a couple of people who didn't abandon him were Eleanor Roosevelt and Howe. They started to cater to him really round the clock, covering just about everything he needed. Feeding him, bathing him, catheterization because he temporarily lost all control of his bodily functions. Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt would be eternally grateful to Howe for the rest of his life. Now, Howe also convinced they don't have this right. He needs another opinion. And so he tried to track down the Harvard professor of orthopedic surgery, Dr. Robert Lovett. Now, Lovett was on vacation, but his staff heard from Howe about the symptoms that Roosevelt was facing, and they said it sounds like poliomyelitis, more commonly known as infantile paralysis. And infantile in the word because most of the people who were getting polio were young children. The last spike of polio in the United States had been in 1916 when over 7,000 people died from the disease. Here in 1921, there was another spike. Over 6,000 cases in the country, over 1,500 people died. For polio, there's no cure and there was no treatment. Well, Dr. Lovett came back from his vacation. He made the trip to Campobello August the 25th now in 1921, found his patient paralyzed from the waist down, and he confirmed he believed this was polio. The case was evidently not of the severest type, said Dr. Lovett, But for that, only time would tell. Now, Roosevelt, again, power of positive thinking was a big part of his persona, a big part of his personality. He didn't want any special treatment. He said, look, I don't want any sob stuff in the relation of my experience. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very much on the same page. She said, we didn't do anything except treat him as a perfectly normal, able-bodied man, which is what he made all of us feel that he was. For Louis Howe, one of these things he's trying to do is to keep all of this quiet. After all, Franklin Roosevelt had just run for the vice presidency the year before, so this was going to be pretty big news if he was going to be paralyzed. Well, the New York Times did pick up the story in mid-September of 1921 because that was the time they were going to head back to New York City. When they did that, he was admitted to Presbyterian Hospital where Dr. George Draper took over his case. Draper was a protege of Dr. Lovett, and he had an interesting first conclusion. Draper said, I cannot say how long Mr. Roosevelt will be kept in the hospital, but you can say definitely he will not be crippled. No one need have any fear of permanent injury from this attack, but of course with polio, frankly, no one knew for sure. By mid-October, there were some improvements for Roosevelt. He was able to sit up on his own, his arm and back muscles were starting to come back, and he got command of his bodily functions again, but from the waist down, complete paralysis, no control from the waist down. Roosevelt in the hospital even started to do a little bit of work. He was getting anxious. Louis Howe would go to the office. Howe actually started noticing some changes in the outlook of Franklin Roosevelt as he was here in the hospital. Suddenly, there he was, flat on his back, with nothing to do but think, Howe recalled. His thoughts expanded. His horizon widened. He began to see the other fellow's point of view. He thought of others who were ill and afflicted and in want. He dwelt on many things which had not bothered him much before. Lying there, he grew bigger day by day. Discharged from the hospital on October the 28th, now getting around mostly in a wheelchair at the house on 65th Street. Howe moved in. In fact, Howe would live with Franklin Roosevelt for the rest of his life. They started some physical therapy, trying to get those leg muscles to re-engage. He would spend hours alone in bed, focusing on trying to move his big toe. Most of the time, of course, not successful. He tried to continue to have that cheery outlook. In fact, a lot of friends would come over to visit. They would feel better when they left than when they arrived because Roosevelt wasn't going to be a downer about this. He was going to still be optimistic about his future. March of 1922 now, he was fitted for steel braces. Now, these would be helpful to keep his legs straight so he could stand up. 14 pounds made it very awkward and actually quite painful at times because sometimes the braces would cut into his legs. He had no control of his hips, so he had a new way of walking, which was basically to use crutches. He would then pivot his head and upper body, and then that would help swing his lower body forward, and this way he could walk. Over the summer of 1922, they all went back to Hyde Park, where Sara Roosevelt had installed ramps to help the wheelchair get around. The big challenge for Roosevelt, he kept trying to move further and further. His goal to go from the front porch to the post road, about a quarter of a mile away from the house. Anna Roosevelt later recalled the sweat pouring down his face, hearing him say, I must get down the driveway today. All the way down the driveway. Still a lot of motivation for Franklin Roosevelt. One of the things that did help seemed to be was water, a swimming pool. The buoyancy of the water seemed to help his legs. So they built a pool at Hyde Park. In the meantime, spent time at his neighbor Vincent Astor's house, which already had a pool. Let's move ahead a year. Now, May of 1923, it's pretty clear that things are not going to improve for Franklin Roosevelt. He is going to be paralyzed from the waist down. He started to return to the office on occasion, but really over the next couple of years, he spent a lot of time in Florida on a houseboat. The warm weather, the warm water, this again helped his spirits, also helped him physically. Eleanor Roosevelt, again, they're mostly moving on to separate lives, even though she had very much cared for him in the onset of polio. She rarely went down to the houseboat in Florida. It was mostly Howe. Missy LeHand was there almost all the time, and a few other friends would come. A lot of speculation about the relationship between Roosevelt and Howe. We've talked about the marriage between Roosevelt and Eleanor and how that was in a previous episode, how they're kind of going into their separate lives. Was there more of a relationship with Missy LeHand? Well, one of his sons, Elliott, thought yes. One thing we do know, certainly she was an incredibly loyal assistant. She understood Roosevelt better than anybody. She spoke her mind to him. They cherished an intimate friendship. Was it more than that? Well, we just don't know. There's no hard evidence one way or the other, but Missy LeHand was by Roosevelt's side really through the rest of his life, or the rest of her life, until she passed in the third term of his presidency. Now, 1924, an opportunity for Roosevelt to return to politics. He's been out of the game for over 3 years now, but New York Governor Al Smith has asked Roosevelt to re-engage and help him with the national campaign for the presidency. So Roosevelt said yes, and the convention, the Democratic convention that year, was going to be his coming out party. He's going to give the nominating speech for Smith at that convention. Now, this is kind of high risk because he was determined to walk to the stage. Now, walking again was a new thing for Roosevelt. He would have the braces for the legs to keep them straight. He would now use a single crutch, and then he would have a firm grip on a companion to kind of help him move forward, always keeping his head up high, smiling. This is how he would get around. Well, for this event, it was James, his oldest son, who was his escort, and James recalled at the convention, as we walked, struggled really, down the aisle to the rear of the platform, he leaned heavily on my arm, gripping me so hard it hurt. It was hot, but the heat in that building did not alone account for the perspiration which beaded on his brow. His hands were wet, his breathing was labored. Leaning on me with one arm, working a crutch with the other, his legs locked stiffly in his braces, he went on his awkward way, but again, his head was up, he was smiling. The entire audience was kind of in awe as Roosevelt is getting to the podium. When he got there, there was a big round of applause, big cheers for Franklin Roosevelt, who then boomed out a really strong speech for Al Smith, which she concluded saying, "Smith has a power to strike at every error and wrongdoing that makes his adversaries quail before him. He has a personality that carries to every hearer not only the sincerity, but the righteousness of what he says. He is the happy warrior of the political battlefield," and there was tremendous applause. Sure, for the Smith's nomination, but really for Franklin Roosevelt. His return to politics, really a triumphant moment, which was captured by the New York Evening World. No matter whether Governor Smith wins or loses, Franklin D. Roosevelt stands out as the real hero of the Democratic Convention of 1924. Adversity has lifted him above the bickering, above the religious bigotry, conflicting personal ambitions, and petty sectional prejudices. It's made him the one leader commanding the respect and admiration of delegations from all sections of the land. Roosevelt might be a pathetic, tragic figure, but for the fine courage that flashes in his smile, it holds observers unchained. It was indeed a triumphant moment for Franklin Roosevelt. As for Al Smith, he did not win the nomination that time going around. So after the convention, what did Roosevelt do? Well, he's still recovering, and a friend of his, George Peabody, said, "Look, I have a hotel in Georgia, Warm Springs, Georgia, not too far from Atlanta. And the therapeutic content of the water there seems to be pretty special. It's always 89, 90 degrees or so, and people seem to do well in it. Why don't you give it a try?" And so Roosevelt said, "Sure, I'll go down." Well, the trip, it was marvelous for Roosevelt really from the very beginning. He got in that water. He could stand without the braces, without holding on to anything, and could walk under his own power in this water. About 4 feet of water, he was able to walk. He said, "Look, how marvelous it feels. I don't think I'll ever get out." He decided to buy the property from his friend George Peabody. $200,000, a lot of money at the time. It had been sort of a rundown hotel, and he wanted to turn it into a place where other polio patients could come. So by 1927, he started the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. They doubled capacity so that they could have up to 50 different patients at any given time. They'd pay $42 for a week, but frankly, no one was ever turned away because of the inability to pay. The two main attractions for these patients at Warm Springs, number one, the water. Number two, Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt with the power to motivate folks. Keep yourselves mentally alert, he would tell them. Don't lose contact with the things you enjoyed before infantile paralysis. In fact, he would show them exercises and keep that power of positive thinking going. Roosevelt said that the spirit of the place has an extraordinary effect on the progress they make. Here they find other people just like themselves. They get over their self-consciousness. The mental factor has a great deal to do with their improvement. Interesting for Roosevelt as well, Warm Springs is in the middle of farm territory, a rural area with a lot of poverty. Now, he would get to know a lot of the locals. He would actually drive around in his custom-built Model T. They had hand levers that were custom designed so that it could move the car around. Got to know a lot of the locals. He listened to them. He understood their problems, which were very real problems. He started thinking about solutions. But that would bring him back to politics, maybe a chance to do something about it. that's a story for another day. That is Franklin Roosevelt and polio from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles.